I'm happy and honored to introduce our next speaker, Professor Yirmiyahu Yovel, which is the founder and the head of the Spinoza Center. And from his vast publication, list of publication, I will mention only his last book, published in Princeton University Press, The Other Within, and that we are all waiting for his new translation of Kant Critique of Pure Reason, which we hope in the next months will be published in Hebrew. Professor Yovel, please.
Thank you very much. The official title of my talk is Spinoza in Kant's Critique. This is an intentionally ambiguous title because it can mean Spinoza in Kant's philosophy of critical philosophy, and it can mean Spinoza as the object of Kant's criticism. I mean both. So together we get something which may be close to Spinoza as a reader, as Kant as a reader of Spinoza. We do not know how much Kant has read of Spinoza directly. He knew about him indirectly through Wolff, who knew about him indirectly through Bale, and he also knew about him through Mendelssohn, especially concerning the philosophy of religion and the state. As a result, not everything that Kant has attributed to Spinoza was true or exact. In addition, above all his direct references to Spinoza, there has been hovering a cloud of prudence and diplomacy that resulted from the pantheismo strike, the very ferocious polemics about Spinoza's philosophy in Germany that was raging. And even before that, because of the bad reputation that Spinoza had in large circles. Spinoza was known as an atheist and a godless philosopher. An atheist at that time was a very bad word, something like a communist in McCarthy's times in America. And you couldn't possibly think of an atheist without immediately connecting this in association to someone very deprived and evil morally, which created a very paradox and a scandal in the image of Spinoza because Spinoza was perceived as righteous. How could a righteous atheist exist is a contradiction in terms, and yet it was attributed to him. Atheism, with its bad connotations, was attributed to him. Kant tried to cope with the image of Spinoza as a righteous atheist in the critique of judgment, and I will come later, I will read the text later on. Now, as we heard just in the first paper, elements mediating between Kant and Spinoza were, among others, Mendelssohn, Lessing, and also Jacobi. All the three of them were the heroes of the big polemics that raged in Germany about Spinoza, which we, I don't know if I have to remind you about it. Maybe I will do this in a few words. Jacobi was a great critic and enemy of the Enlightenment, of the German Enlightenment. He stood for irrational faith as the absolute anchor of truth, and he believed that reason can lead only to atheism and fatalism. The paradigm for this was Spinoza. Spinoza was the greatest rational philosopher to him, because if you start from reason, you must end in Spinoza. He's the most consequential philosopher. But what were the consequences? The consequences was fatalism, atheism, everything bad that can be thought of. Therefore, reason is faulty. Reason cannot... Spinoza is the great paradigm that proves that reason cannot be relied upon as the gauge of truth. And we need something else. We need another authority, the authority of an irrational leap, long before Kierkegaard, into faith and into a soi-disant, naive adoption and embracing of that faith. And this very Jacobi came out after Lessing died, and he came out with a story. He published his reminiscences of his last visit with Lessing, saying that Lessing has confessed to him that he was really a Spinozist. Maybe if Jacobi had listened to Willy Gottschall's talk, he shouldn't have had to bring such evidence. It was very, very clear that it was the case. But what does it mean? It meant that Lessing was stained. Lessing was an atheist and a fatalist and someone who is very bad, who is very associated with depravity. How can this be? But if he confessed to have been a Spinozist, that is what he was. That was not all. Lessing is a great friend. The great friend was called Moses Mendelssohn. Some people believe that Nathan der Weise was modeled on Mendelssohn. And so if Lessing was a Spinozist, Mendelssohn was a Spinozist. Another Jew, another Judeus et Atheista, as Spinoza was called in his old time. That was an additional scandal. And Mendelssohn, because Spinoza at that time was perceived very badly, tried diplomatically to deny his links to Spinoza, although they were very, very real. Jacobi wanted Kant to intervene. The polemics raged in Germany. Kant had to be diplomatic. Kant did not prove himself to be the emblem of courage at that time. And he used a lot of dual language. If we are looking for esotericism and dual language in the rise of the history of ideas, we don't have to look to Spinoza. Even Kant was using dual language, both in his pronunciations about these polemics and also in his book on religion, to which I will get in the last part of my talk. Now, an example of this duality in Kant's discourse can be provided by a comparison between Kant's letter to Marcus Hertz and his letter to Jacobi during the strife, during the polemics. Marcus Hertz was a former student of Kant, a Jewish student who lived then in Berlin and was very close to Mendelssohn. He was also very close to Kant. By the way, the only meager information that we have of what was going on in Kant's work and head during the 11 years in which he was completely silent, published nothing but only worked on the critique. The very meager information we know about that period comes from Kant's letters to Marcus Hertz. So Marcus Hertz was close both to him and to Mendelssohn. Now, if we compare these two letters, then to Marcus Hertz, Kant writes, "Oh, in the caprice of Jacobi there is nothing serious. This is a buffoonery, clowning, which deserves not even to be answered." But in a letter to Jacobi about 3 years later, he praises what he calls the newest edition of your handsome book on Spinoza, and adds that Jacobi has gained a reputation in his critique of the difficulties of Spinoza as a theologist. And then he says about himself, "I was required by various people to cleanse myself of the suspicion of Spinozism." To cleanse myself of the suspicion of Spinozism. Now, indeed, this thing he tried to do in a very famous essay called "What is Orientation in Thinking?", which is, in a way, his contribution to the pantheism strife. However, even in this essay, which apparently was destined to distance himself from Spinoza, Kant subscribes to the very basic position of both Spinoza and Mendelssohn, and against Jacobi, saying that we have only reason, exclusively reason, as the exclusive gauge of truth. He says it in the essay, first of all, and this is a dagger blow, a fatal dagger blow to the thesis of Jacobi about the need for a parallel and higher authority of faith, of irrational faith, and a clear subscription to Spinoza. Moreover, in this very letter in which he writes flatteringly to Jacobi, in substance, Kant denounces Jacobi at the most crucial point, namely, he argues in complete agreement with Spinoza and Mendelssohn, again, the truth has no other criteria but reason, and that even, I quote, even the inevitable addition to reason, which Kant calls in his practical philosophy rational faith, not irrational faith, but rational faith, even that inevitable addition to reason derives from reason itself, although not from theoretical reason, but from practical reason. So we can see his diplomacy, we can see his writing between the lines, but it becomes very clear that he supports the Spinoza-Mendelssohn position very strongly against Jacobi, although he tries to conceal this fact from a certain part of the public. Now there are lots of direct references to Spinoza in Kant's opus, but because this ambiguous context of his discourse, I will not consider them, but I shall consider the relation between ideas and issues rather than names. I have a list of points in which I wanted to do this comparison, but of course I do not have enough time. So I will take about 3 or 4, and I'll go very, very, very fast through them. First of all, the foundations of philosophy and of the Aufklärung, of enlightenment. The first point here would be, the first point in this issue would be the exclusive power of reason, the exclusive authority of reason, and the essence of Aufklärung. Mendelssohn was accepted as a representative of the Aufklärung, and he himself sees Spinoza as its forerunner, as we also learned from Gottschall. Now, according to Mendelssohn, the essence of Aufklärung was the abolition of prejudice and superstition, the critique of religious establishment as a power establishment, and the evolution of the intellect to fulfill its destiny. Reason is the very sole authority, and whatever does not stand the critique of reason has to be abolished. Kant accepts all of this, but he adds 2 main points. First, this applies also when we have to limit reason and show its finitude. Reason is the highest authority, and yet it is limited and cannot transgress its limits. Secondly, it's not only a matter of developing the intellect. Aufklärung is also, and above all, the will and the courage to stand up for reason, not only to follow it automatically. But the main thing, and this is a very deep point in Kant, which has not been understood at his time, and is very often misunderstood today, namely that the exclusive power of the authority of reason applies even when it has to be limited. Limited reason does not call for so-called a second complementary source of authority to help it from the side, from behind, from below, from above, all we have is reason, and all we have is limited reason, and this is what we have to cope with, and this is the only way we can go about seeking truth and conducting our lives. This is. I didn't preach anything. I'm a textual interpreter. The second point in which basic Spinozism occurs in Kant's foundation of philosophy is something that I called, in my book on Spinoza and other heretics, the philosophy of immanence. And I think Kant, although with a qualification, not very easily, but possibly, can and should be understood as a philosopher of immanence, or rather as a humanistic philosopher of immanence. By philosophy of immanence, I understand the philosophy of this worldliness, which refuses to commit itself to anything beyond it, but accepts all the areas or all the relevant areas of life and intellectual and emotional concern that we have to are focused in this world. First of all, this world is the only horizon of acceptable existence or actuality. We cannot accept any actuality beyond it. Secondly, this world is also the only valid source of normative propositions and beliefs, namely morality, politics, even religion cannot be based on anything but the morality that we have in this world. And thirdly, this world is also the only source or the only resource from which we can draw anything that can serve or be understood as salvation, liberation, progress, and so on. In all these three respects, Kant's philosophy is a humanistic philosophy of immanence. It places man at the center of being, and it grounds all significant domains of the natural and moral world in man's free, though limited, rational powers. No creator God must be presupposed in order to explain the work of nature or account for real objects in it. This is Kant. And a divine legislator is neither needed nor allowed in order to prescribe the laws of morality or to establish political legitimacy. Neither needed nor allowed to prescribe those things. Even religion must be grounded in the autonomy of the moral human will, which assumes the sanctity that tradition has attributed to God. This is why Kant was attached to the principle of immanence in what counts most. It is true that at the same time Kant clung to the is-or distinction and opposed Spinoza in being an anti-naturalist and a dualist. But it should be observed that all his concern, or Kant's concern that is, were this worldly, that they were centered on the actual world and on this life. Human reasoning in Kant, it is true that human reasoning in Kant is distinct from nature, yet both together constitute the immanent human domain. I say it again. Although human reason in Kant is distinct from nature, yet both together, nature and reason, constitute the immanent human domain. Man is a this-worldly creature throughout, split in his being, and since reason is a priori, it ought to imprint its laws and moral meanings on nature. But even as it does so, human reason acts as part of the immanent domain no less than the nature it confronts. Well, this can be developed further, but as I said, I will give you only the outline of the points that I want to stress. I now turn to Spinoza's metaphysics. I have 2 points on this issue, where I speak only on one. Reason and the absolute. The way Kant portrays reason is not only in its role in constructing the immanent world, both in science, in objective knowledge, and in the knowledge of objects, and in the knowledge of, and in morality, but also as an aspiration to the absolute, which reminds us of Spinoza. The aspiration of the absolute, an inevitable march from any partial explanation, from any partial cause and effect to the next condition, to the next condition, to the next condition, to the next condition, which is insatiable and can stop only when the totality, when the absolute, which has no more any conditions, will be attained, except it cannot never be attained. We are always on the way, we can always progress, but we cannot attain this absolute for which our reason is constructed as a tendency or as a drive, as an insatiable demand to go further beyond any partial or fragmentary explanation. The point here is Spinozistic in that the unconditioned or the absolute is interpreted in Kant in terms of the totality. It is not one member, it is not the absolute is not a privileged super member in the system, but it is the whole system as a totality. A totality is, in Kant's philosophy of reason and dialectic, the totality is an explication or an interpretation of what the unconditioned, what the absolute means. And this is a novelty in philosophy. Perhaps there was some minor philosopher who did it before, but a major philosopher who did it before was Spinoza. For Spinoza, the unconditioned, of course, as we know, was interpreted as the totality of all there is. A totality is unconditioned for the simple reason that there is nothing relevant outside it that can condition it. Everything relevant is by definition already included in it, and therefore no special privileged individual element or item can be its condition. So Spinoza's whole way of thinking is Spinoza's whole way of thinking is guided by the idea of a totality. The unconditioned is a totality. Kant adopts this very idea. When he starts with the view that reason is a drive, I once even called it an erotic drive in the Platonic sense, towards the absolute, he immediately understands the absolute and in terms of the totalization. And the equation between the unconditioned and the totality is a major Spinozistic way of thinking that Kant adopts into his own metaphysics. This is a presence of Spinoza in the heart of Kant's metaphysics, almost with a signature. Benedictus de Spinoza, here I am. And but there is one major difference, and this is a huge difference. In Spinoza, the totality is an actual totality. It can be established as truth, not only as truth, but as the first truth. The first idea vera of philosophy is the totality of all there is, being its own explanation, its own justification, its own cause, being deserving the term, seriously deserving the word, the name of God. In Spinoza, it is a dream. In Kant, it is a dream. In Kant, it is the horizon of reason that can neither be eliminated nor be attained. You cannot take it away, you cannot take this horizon away from the activity of reason, and you can never expire reason to attain it. And this tension between the two necessities, or between the two inevitabilities, the inevitability of the horizon of the totality as emerging from reason itself, it does not emerge from any, it's not a mistake, it's not a prejudice, it's not a superstition. It is a rational aspiration, it is a rational horizon that reason from its very essence, from its very nature, aspires to. And on the other hand, it is by its very constitution, again, that is to say, on rational grounds, it cannot be attained, it must. So you may say that in the systematic unconscious of Kant's doctrine, Spinoza is the object of a dream and an aspiration. But this is an aspiration that cannot be realized, and yet it is not a cause of frustration, of despair, but it is turned back into the immanent world of experience as a regulative principle, as we know Kant, that is to say, as a positive, constructive principle which extends the domain of knowledge and of Aufklärung. Well, the last point that I don't have time to expound it, but I will mention two very fast. One of these reference to Spinoza, I cannot give it up. The reference to Spinoza in the Critique of Judgment, paragraph 87, in which he says, in which he repeats another element that is common to Kant and Spinoza, and this is that we do not need a God in order for morality to be valid. The validity of morality does not depend upon the existence of a divine God that commands and promises and rewards or punishes. This is a basic principle in Spinoza. This is also a basic principle in Kant. And it recurs in paragraph 87 of the Critique of Judgment, where Kant calls Spinoza, he says, we can thus assume a righteous man like Spinoza who takes himself to be firmly convinced that there is no God, and so on and so forth, and yet will keep to the laws of morality with very strict adherence. He calls him a righteous, actually what he called him here is a righteous atheist, exactly the same term that was used to understand Spinoza, which I called in my book a scandal, an impossibility, a scandal and a possibility, a righteous atheist. And for him, a righteous atheist is possible. You do not need God in order to be. Not only do you not need God to promise, to command, and to reward, you have to disregard the problem of God in order for morality to arise, because morality is based on the single autonomy of the human will, not on the divine will. And he goes on there to do other things which I do not have time to. The last point, which I would have told you about if I had the time, is a very important one. It concerns the philosophy of religion. Kant has a philosophy of a purified religion de phénomène, religion of reason, which consists only in moral commands, in accepting moral commands as divine command. That is to say, based upon praxis, and has no cognitive theology whatsoever, has nothing to say cognitively about God, being there, not being there, whatever. There is only the a religion of reason has to do only with commands, with practice. Spinoza, as we know, has a popular religion of reason, not a philosophical one, but a popular one, This is more or less the same. It's based only on praxis and not upon cognitive claims. And the link between the two was clearly Moses Mendelssohn's book Jerusalem, which he attributes, where he attributes this character, this feature to Judaism. Kant takes it from Judaism, bases it on the Religion der Vernunft überhaupt in general. But, and I will leave you with this unpleasant thought, what for Moses Mendelssohn was a positive aspect of Judaism, in Kant it turns out to be a very harsh critique of Judaism. Judaism is not a religion at all, it's only a political constitution. This he takes directly from Spinoza's TTP. And in being a political constitution, it's only legalistic and not moralistic. On the other hand, if you want to be if you want to have a true religion of reason, you have to forego Judaism's political praxis and turn only to a purely internal moral praxis, which will then assume all the holiness and sanctity of the old historical religions which it abolishes. So there is on the one hand, there is a very grand view, enlightened view of a new form of religiosity without God, based upon the human heart and the human will in Kant, which may be a grand view of the Enlightenment. And on the other hand is the very prejudicial, anti-Jewish, thank you for it, because I wanted to emphasize this point. Prejudicial and unfair to Judaism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yovel.